Thank you. It's very much a pleasure to be here and to be able to give a lecture as part of this Emory Williams Memorial Lectureship. It's also a pleasure to visit Emory University for the first time, even though my sister graduated from here in 1979, and I texted her ahead and said, how is it that I've never been here when you were a student, you know? And it turned out that we were living in Japan while she was a student, and it was too expensive, and so she, poor girl, just had 4 years at college without a single visit from family. Now, I understand that many of you have just been through the first year orientation, and as part of that orientation, have had an introduction to Emory's honor code. And really, whether you're at Emory or at Oberlin or any other kind of university or college, you enter the academic community in part by agreeing to adhere to an honor code. So I did a little studying ahead of time and read through Emory's, it's like a multi-page document online about the honor code and values at Emory. And so the preamble of your honor code reads, upon every individual who is part of Emory University falls the responsibility for maintaining in the life of Emory a standard of unimpeachable honor in all academic work. And then among the 6 types of misconduct that are mentioned, you have plagiarism, namely using the work or words of another person and claiming that they are your own. An honor code in many ways defines a community. It's an articulation of shared values. And some of the values that are enshrined within an honor code include academic integrity, respect for authorship, and respect for originality, or the original idea. So adherence to the honor code places Emory and even places you in a larger academic community of shared values. And this community is actually a global community. Nonetheless, the value that we here at Emory and more broadly in Western academia place on authorship, on originality, on attribution of sources is not really a timeless or universal value. It's certainly not timeless or universal in its practice or application. So as mentioned, I'm a professor of the ancient Near East. I focus most of my study on the Hebrew Bible or on ancient Israel and Judah as those that produced the Old Testament. And so I tend to live a good part of my life in what you might call BC rather than AD. I look at texts that date to the 2nd and 1st millenniums before the Common Era. And what I want to do today is take you through some of these texts, some biblical, some from the broader culture of the ancient Near East, and look at what are the values, the literary, academic core values of the writing community of this ancient world, and how do they match up or not so closely match up with the values that we have enshrined in an honor code. Okay. In many of the texts that I study, the ancient world does in fact adhere to the values that we would recognize. Ancient authors, for example, had tremendous respect for the written word. They knew that it was powerful, and this is largely because the vast majority of people in the ancient world were illiterate. And so it didn't matter if you could read or understand the written word. Simply the appearance of writing would be enough to communicate to the viewer power and a sense of reverence. You would look, it also wouldn't be something like we have where there's scrap paper, we're each writing little stuff on scrap paper, sending texts. You wouldn't have that kind of medium for writing. Often it's going to be some enormous stele, stone inscribed writing. Other times it would be a papyrus scroll. You wouldn't have common writing. So just the appearance of it communicates power. In the Bible, common people are not depicted writing. They're not depicted reading. Instead, the act of writing in the Bible is associated with God, scribes, some kings, and a few queens. One of the ways that the power of writing is asserted in ancient texts was through attributing the text to a revered figure. So you may know possibly from Cecil B. DeMille's Ten Commandments, if not from having read the Bible itself, that we have this image of God presenting the tablets to Moses on Mount Sinai, and he is said in Exodus to have written the Ten Commandments with his finger, inscribed by the finger of God. So here we have an idea of a written text, and the author is understood to be divine. Other places in the Bible are the entire Pentateuch or Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, are attributed to Moses. He's said to have written the entire Torah. All of the book of Psalms is attributed to David. When you look closely at these books or collections and you see references to dates, there's no way we can actually say all the Psalms are actually written by David. Instead, they seem to be attributed to him because he was remembered as a poet. He was remembered as a musician who played the lyre. And so therefore, the book of Psalms, if you wrote a good psalm and it was included, it deserved to be called of David, and therefore part of this book of Psalms. The attribution of a work of writing to God is not unique to the Bible, so I thought I'd show you a couple examples. This is the Law Code of Hammurabi, written on a basalt stele in cuneiform text. And I think actually what becomes most important is another sort of view, is that because, again, the vast majority of people couldn't read the cuneiform text, they didn't know what the laws said, you have to accompany the text with an image. So this is a close-up of the image on the top, and here we have the sun god Shamash. We know him, he's seated on the right, enthroned, he has a headpiece that is distinct to divinity, and he is handing a scroll over to King Hammurabi, and so we have the same idea of sort of God and Moses, only here it's Shamash and Hammurabi. The understanding is that this law code has its authority in divine authorship. Now, this practice is obviously very different from our own modern Western academic norms. Few of us claim divine authority for any of our college essays, and probably attributing some of your better ideas to Moses will not go well either. But we do have some examples in the Bible and the larger ancient Near Eastern context that are closer to our own practices of citation. So, for example, in the historical books of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, these books basically tell the entire history of kingship in ancient Israel and Judah. And they go back and forth, introducing the king of Israel, then the king of Judah, the king of Israel, then the king of Judah, moving forward in time. Each king is introduced formulaically with identification of his name, the number of years he reigned, and his mother's name. Okay? So there's a formula. And I have an example. Let's see. Okay, Abijam began to reign over Judah. He reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, daughter of Abishalom. All right, so that kind of introduction every king gets. Then what follows is more of a summary of the highs and lows of that particular king. So it's specific to each king. And in this case, the historians judge him poorly. They think he's a horrible sinner, a terrible disappointment. They do mention that he fought this one war with the Ammonites that was successful, but in general, he gets bad press. At the end, the close, we go back to the formula, and the formula cites a source. Let's see. The rest of the acts of Abijam and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? Here we have something that's very close to our modern sense of a citation. Now, I put it in italics. The Hebrew text wouldn't have it in italics, so I kind of already clued you in that I'm seeing this as a written source that's available. Nobody has found the annals of the kings of Judah, but nonetheless, there's no reason for us to suspect they were made up. It's likely there was a written source on the monarchy, and the writer of this history was drawing from it. And he's basically telling his readers, if you want to know more about this king, I've just selected out a couple things. You can refer to this. It's sort of like the optional reading on a syllabus that we all tend to ignore. But it's a good idea. You know, this would be a great idea. Read further. So we have other books that are mentioned in the Bible, a complementary book, the book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel, and then we have a book of Jashar. So the ancients did have some written sources, and they knew how to cite them, and through citing them to give their own work a stamp of authority. There's also an Akkadian text dating to the 15th century BCE called the Autobiography of Idrimi. This is one of my favorite examples for how ancient writers asserted authorship. In this case, rather than simply footnote, the author commissioned a sculpture of himself. That's rather a lot of work to go to in order to assert your authorship. So you would see this sculpture, and you would say, now who is the author of this text? And the answer would be there because it's the man seated here, Idrimi, and the reason that you know he's the author is the text is in fact written across his chest. And it's hard to see that the cuneiform text is inscribed across his chest. But then even more, to just really get the point across, I, Idrimi, wrote this. It starts at the side of his mouth. You know, the words are literally coming forth from his mouth. So it's the ancient equivalent, really, of our cartoon bubble. You know, if the little arrow is pointing to this head, we know that person said it. Here, the cuneiform's coming out of his mouth. We know that this is what Idrimi said. So in the 104 lines of cuneiform text, Idrimi brags about his tremendous military victories, his generosity as a ruler, how good life is under his rule, and he repeatedly emphasizes his own legitimacy as the king of Alalach, a city in northern Syria. Many scholars suspect that this text was in fact written far later than the time of Idrimi, and they note that in king lists from this area, the name Idrimi doesn't even appear, so he doesn't seem to be a legitimate known king. So it may be that commissioning a sculpture, placing your words across your chest, having the words come out of your very mouth is the kind of red flag that some of us, our professors, see, saying you're trying too hard, and I think something might be fishy here. And that's what scholars basically have concluded, that the autobiography of Idrimi is in fact a pious biography written centuries later to assert a claim on a land at a later date. Okay, it should also not surprise us that ancient writers knew how to cheat and how to accuse each other of cheating. So the prophet Jeremiah, for example, sees the political and religious downfall of his people in Judah, and he attributes the devastation to what he calls the false pen of scribes. And the false pen of scribes has made the law of the Lord into a lie. For Jeremiah, there's a whole class of prophets that he accuses of prophesying falsely, and he reports that God himself has accused this group of, quote, prophesying lies in my name. False attribution. Another example comes from Queen Jezebel. Now, you may know the Jezebel from popular culture, right? Well, Queen Jezebel in the Bible, she's worth reading about. She gets horribly unfair coverage from the biblical authors. She's accused of all sorts of evil and terrible things. But among the evil things that she is said to have done is to have written letters in the name of her husband, King Ahab, and sealed them with his seal. So this idea of plagiarizing your husband, and especially plagiarizing your husband the king, and sending out words in his name is listed as one of her many sins. The ancient world did not have an honor council to deal with suspected cases of plagiarism or false attribution or the false pen. There's no detailed set of procedures for a first or second offense, but it had something that in my view is likely far better as a deterrent. Cursing. Describing in detail what would happen to you, your children, and your as yet unborn descendants should you cheat. And they describe it in often horrific and terror-inducing detail. So let's turn again back to Idrimi, because his inscription ends, He who removes this my statue, may his seed be ended. May his seed be closed to the underworld. May the gods of the sky and the earth divide his kingdom and his country. He who changes it in any way, whatever. I think this is what's referring to the text. Don't change my text. Don't change my view of history. May Teshub, the Lord of the sky and the earth, among the great gods in his land, destroy his name and his descendants. Now I have one other example. It's not as good as a photo op, I'm afraid, but when you're dealing with things coming from the ancient world, some are beautiful and others are a little bit rough. This one's a little bit rough. This is a stele of an ancient king of Gubal or Byblos in present-day Lebanon, and his name is Yechamilk. This king also commissioned a limestone stele inscription commemorating an altar that he had made to honor his goddess, the goddess of Byblos. So the stele depicts the goddess, and I did do a close-up. We'll see how good it shows. Can you kind of see? It depicts the goddess seated on a throne with a winged sun above her head, and she's holding a scepter in her hand. And with her free hand, she's blessing the king, Yechamilk. The stele dates to the 5th or the 4th century BCE, and it's written in Phoenician, and it's currently housed in the Louvre. The content of the inscription describes an ornate altar that this king had fashioned for his goddess. And at the end of the inscription, the king shows an awareness of this historical pattern of altering the words of a previous generation's accomplishments. He knows how people sometimes take credit for the written work and the material accomplishment of their forebears. And so he closes by saying, the king's work has to be protected, whoever you are, every king and or every ordinary man who will do additional work on this altar and or this open engraving of gold and or on this portico, my name, that of mine, Yechamilk, king of Byblos, you must put with yours on that work. And if you will not put my name with yours, and or if you will remove this work, and or shift this with its base upon this place, may the lady mistress of Byblos putrefy him, that man, and his seed, in the face of all the gods of Byblos. So clearly, at least in these two cases, the curses seem to be fairly effective because the statues have endured. On the other hand, they're clearly not in their original situation. They have been moved from their bases. They're both in museums. And so far as I know, museum visitors, owners, purchasers have not had them and their seeds, disappear in strange ways. But all of this says that the ancient world in some ways is very different from our own, because clearly we're not attributing our most important works to God. We're no longer claiming, this one's really good, and I think I'm just going to say God wrote it, which I don't think the ancients did either. I think the ancients weren't speaking falsely. They were speaking out of a different worldview. We don't attribute it to some famous revered figure in order to put ourselves in the line of that figure, or put an author that we appreciate in the line of a figure that we think he or she belongs with. On the other hand, it's clear that the use of written sources in history was something they knew how to do. They knew how to attribute it. We also find that the ancients shared our animosity toward those who would alter the words of an earlier writer or write in the name of another in order to lay claim to that person's accomplishments. But now I want to turn to a messier example. These are kind of clear examples. And clear examples are great, and quite honestly, I had to cut a bunch. There's a whole bunch of curses. There's a whole bunch of places where it's like, I myself wrote this. There's plenty of bragging going on in the ancient world and attributing your own words to others. I had to cut things. But I wanted to turn to a messier example because I think it's more emblematic of what we actually find in the Bible as a whole. So I'm going to turn to the book of Isaiah, and I'm not going to assume any of you have read it. But I think it helps us get into the complexity of the issue of authorship and originality. So let me first start with our modern setting and what our modern expectations are. When I say that I'm turning to a messier example with Isaiah, I have to admit that when we talk about the Bible and plagiarism, we're already navigating a messy topic. So to speak about authorship, attribution, and plagiarism as it relates to the Bible is to tread on sensitive ground, both religiously and politically. In the United States today, a sizable proportion of our population sees the Bible as a static, unchanging, and therefore authoritative text. Our presidents are sworn into office with their hand on a Bible. Now, significantly, I think, the Bible that they're sworn in on is closed. It's a revered object. It's not read from. So in this situation, I think the Bible is acting as an object that stands for integrity, honesty, the shared values of good governance in the country. I might also note that the Bible has already made several notable appearances in the 2016 presidential race, again, often as a closed book rather than one that's opened and read. It's not uncommon to hear people refer to biblical values or biblical principles as if there were a static, unchanging, and agreed upon set of values that the Bible, again, as a whole, puts forward. So let's face it, as human beings, we love certainty. We love stability, and we would love to have a set version of our history and our values that we could agree on. If we had that shared history, that one that we all agreed on, and here I'm talking about American history, not biblical history, then we might be able to agree on who we are as Americans, or at least who we should be. So it's in the service of this need or desire for a stable version of our past that the Bible is introduced as a static and unchanging authoritative text. And the Bible serves this goal best when its covers are closed, when it's not actually read, when the Bible is an object upon which we swear an oath, or an object in the hand of a presidential candidate, its closed and unread status allows it to stand for presumed, unchanging biblical values. Certainty and stability come at a cost. It's only when we open the book and read it carefully, as you might in a course here at Emory, should you choose to take a course on the Bible here at Emory, once you open it and read it in that kind of setting, the actively negotiated sense of truth, the changing view of God, and the evolving self-understanding of a people, the Israelites and the Judeans, becomes apparent. And through retelling, reshaping, and repurposing the stories of their past, biblical writers continually brought their own experience into a dynamic conversation with their forebears. If a single person had written the Bible with one clear message that could be dated to one specific and identifiable time, I am sure we would not be reading it today. No one would have bothered to copy that person's singular story, to retell it, to preserve it, canonize it, set it to music, allude to it in literature, paint it, preach it, and yes, hold it aloft on the political stump. It's the complexity of the Bible's authorship, the slow unfolding of its narrative as each generation comments upon and updates the traditions of its forebears. It's that unfolding that is the reason that after 2,000 years, we're still reading this book. We're still finding things in it. So let me now turn to the book of Isaiah. The first thing to sort of clarify about Isaiah is that it's not a book, it's a scroll. And as a scroll, if you were to unroll it, it has 65 chapters. It's one of the longest prophetic books. The author of this scroll is identified in the first verse. Oh, I keep thinking I'll do this. The prophecies of Isaiah, son of Amoz, who prophesied concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Well, this is actually a great start from a historical perspective. It sounds quite certain, and in fact, we have extra biblical sources that can attest to some of these kings, and so we can very confidently date Isaiah, son of Amoz, to the 8th century BCE. We rarely have that kind of certainty. So this opening verse of Isaiah sounds, and in fact is, close to history. If we skip forward a bit to chapter 6, we learn something about Isaiah's understanding of his God and his prophetic mission. Isaiah says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the hem of his robe filled the temple." The vision continues, describing the winged seraphim that attend to God on his throne and call to each other, saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." Now, several of the details in this prophecy vision tell us that where Isaiah is standing in the vision is the temple in Jerusalem. So he sees himself in the innermost sanctum here, called the Holy of Holies. And that's where the footstool of the deity, the Ark of the Covenant, was understood, and it's flanked by the two winged creatures that Isaiah is here seeing as seraphim, fiery winged creatures. And he imagines his God as so enormous that his head extends vertically upwards into the heavens, and he can in fact hear his God talking to other beings, having a conversation in the heavens. "Who shall we send?" And he answers, "Here I am, you can send me." So he's having this vertical auditory experience of the divine way up in heaven. At the same time, the hem of God's garments are filling the entire space of the temple. So he has a supersized image of God. In comparison to the immensity of his God, Isaiah sees himself as small and unworthy. "Woe is me," he says in response to this vision, "I am lost." Once he volunteers to take on this mission, God gives him his commissioning, so to speak, and what he's told to do is nearly impossible. It is impossible. It's purposely impossible. This is what God tells him to do. He says, "Say to this people," the Judeans and those people in Jerusalem, say, "Keep listening, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand. Make the mind of this people dull, and stop their ears and shut their eyes." So God seems in this text to have already decided that his chosen people, the Judeans, will be destroyed. The message is one of certain doom and even deserved punishment. Later in chapter 10 of Isaiah, we learn that the enemy that will deliver the punishment is a foreign empire. Isaiah hears his God calling out, "Ah, Assyria, rod of my anger, in whose hand as a staff is my fury. I send him out against an ungodly nation. I charge him against a people that provokes me." So the foreign empire of Assyria, a known empire for which we have all sorts of documentation and archaeological evidence, is presented as a weapon in the hand of the Israelite God, a weapon that will deliver a military conquest over Judah and Jerusalem as punishment. Each of these details, a Jerusalem temple, King Hezekiah, Assyria as a foreign empire, fits very well with an 8th century date for Isaiah. Now we're going to jump ahead in the book to chapter 40, to some verses that will sound familiar to many of you. Chapter 40 begins, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins." So who doesn't know the Bible nonetheless knows this from something? Yes? Go ahead, tell me.
It's the Messiah.
Yeah. You know, at Oberlin, I could say, anybody want to stand and sing a couple bars? Because they're all, you know, at the conservatory and amazing singers. But yes, often a lot of us know this music. Second Isaiah is all over Handel's Messiah. So is First Isaiah. But we know this. It's become part of our culture. But if we read it in light of what I've just told you about the first chapters in Isaiah, we can recognize in the words, "Comfort, O comfort, my people, says your God, speak tenderly to Jerusalem," something has changed. The God who announced doom and conquest, who had said that Jerusalem was riddled with guilt, that her punishment was certain, this God is now speaking of comfort, tenderness. When we move forward from chapter 40, we find additional clues to a changed historical context. The named enemy is no longer the 8th century enemy, Assyria. Assyria is long gone. We've already had Babylonia, and they're gone. And the named enemy is now Cyrus of Persia. And Isaiah mentions him multiple times. Isaiah has the Lord call Cyrus his anointed one, his Mashiach. He has him call Cyrus the Lord's shepherd. The message of Isaiah here is that the Lord has aroused Cyrus in order that he can rebuild my city and set my exiles free. So in the first chapters of Isaiah, Assyria is a weapon in the hand of God. But after chapter 40, the Israelite God reaches out and grasps the right hand of Cyrus of Persia in order to subdue other nations and to rebuild Jerusalem. So we're in a different historical context. And these discrepancies in date, tone, and style caused biblical scholars already in the late 1800s to mark a break in the book of Isaiah between chapters 39 and 40. And they argued, now for over a century, that the 8th century prophet named Isaiah, who lived in Jerusalem under the threat of an Assyrian empire, his words are in chapters 1 through 39. I'm somewhat oversimplifying, but in general this works. And a second author, a 6th century anonymous writer, who lived as an exile in Babylonia at a time when Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, was on the ascent. The words of this second author are found in chapters 40 through 55 and possibly through the end of the book. What's interesting for our purposes today is that there's nothing that marks the transition from chapter 39 to 40 as, oh, we're now in a different historical context and there's a new writer. The attribution in verse 1 that this is Isaiah, son of Amoz, seems to apply to the entire scroll. And so in order for us to know that something has shifted, we have to just pay attention to the details. And when you read the details of chapters 40 to 55, whoever wrote them was clearly not trying to hide that what he was doing was something new. I'll go ahead and put the blanks. I don't have any more pictures. Unfortunately, once we get to the Bible, we don't have a lot of things that survive in the sands that are artistic. So when scholars first began to do this spade work of identifying separate sources, dating them, there was a drive on the part of biblical scholars to uncover what they thought of was the original text, or the authentic words of the historical Isaiah. And this scholarly impulse was most fully developed with regard to the words of Jesus in the New Testament, where scholars sought to use logic and a kind of scientific method to determine which words from each Gospels could be traced back to the historical Jesus. So for each book of the Bible, later editorial layers were identified, peeled back, and discarded for their inauthenticity, for masquerading as something they were not. And at the same time, true historical kernels were marked out as the real Isaiah or the historical Jesus, and therefore an authoritative original text. Now a problem arises because what we discover is that once we've peeled back the editorial layers, and discarded them and identified the historical kernels, the reconstructed originals, we find that they've lost their artistic beauty. They have no enduring complexity. They're one-dimensional, and as a result, have ceased to be great literature and aren't very profound theologically either. So let's return to what we've identified as Second Isaiah. He's an anonymous author. We don't know who wrote at this later time period. There's no question that if this work, 40 through 55 of Isaiah, were brought before your honor council, whoever wrote it and attributed it to Isaiah, son of Amoz, would be found guilty of writing under a false name, of citing numerous biblical sources without proper citation. At the same time, there is tremendous originality in the writing of these chapters. It's unlikely that Second Isaiah put forward these words as being in the name of Isaiah. Some later scribe who's reading these words somehow associated the words of this writer with the words of Isaiah, son of Amoz. In a way, when you put them together, you see that this second Isaiah is a kind of sequel to the first. Or another way of looking at it is that second Isaiah answers first Isaiah. It's not as neat as that, but there's a reason why some later compiler might have taken the words of this exilic author and put them next to an 8th century author without marking them as a change. So when we look at the actual words of this second Isaiah, we find that he's not hiding newness. Instead, he seems to herald the originality of his work with repeated references to, quote, new things and new creations. More than in any other book in the Bible, second Isaiah refers to begetting, conceiving, forming in the womb, laboring, birthing, and overcoming barrenness. He is all about newness, all about a restored creation. For this later prophet, God is about to do what he calls a new thing, and he will cause his people to hear new words. And in response to the newness, he calls on his people to sing to the Lord a new song. He deploys the language of creation from Genesis 1 through 3, so he's reaching back in time and applying it to his own context. And the later prophet no longer imagines his God confined within the physical space of the Jerusalem temple, because as big as Isaiah, son of Amoz's God was, he was nonetheless somehow understood to be localized in Jerusalem and especially accessible through the Jerusalem temple. When we get to second Isaiah, the imagery explodes outward, and this is a God who spreads the heavens like a curtain and spreads the earth under it. He's a cosmic deity with no boundaries. Again and again in these chapters we hear, also unique to this part of the Bible, clear articulations where the Israelite God is now the only God. I am the Lord, besides me there is no other. So he's got a more, I should just say, a different theology. It's no longer a localized Israelite God in Jerusalem. It's a cosmic deity of all creation who is speaking new things to this prophet. The writer of second Isaiah, and this is one of the reasons why I chose him, also seems to be a bit conflicted on how to use his sources. He refers to his sources as, quote, the former things, or the things of old. And what he means by this is the traditions of his ancestors that he's received, likely in written form, but also orally. So he's got some resources from his ancestors, some wisdom that's been passed down, and he doesn't know what he wants to use and what he wants to discard. So we find in Isaiah 43, he says, do not remember the former things, the things of old. And the reason is because God's about to do something new. So forget all that. Forget the former things. Then in Isaiah 46 and in several other places, he says, remember the former things, the things of old, because God's purposes have remained unchanged and they are coming to pass. So for 2nd Isaiah, the former things are a problem. How much do I reach back and take what I've received from the ancestors, and how much do I discard? He does take things. There are places where he refers, for example, to Abraham, your father, and Sarah, who bore you. He refers to the Exodus and uses the language of the Exodus to describe that when his people are allowed to return from exile to Judah, it will be like a new Exodus, like God rescuing a people oppressed and delivering them from slavery. So he's clearly alluding to the earlier stories. On the other hand, he's emphasizing something new. He's trying to repackage, repurpose, and sift through the received tradition of his ancestors in order to present a word that means something to a people that's experienced exile. The people that this author is talking to is very different from the people that Isaiah, son of Amoz, spoke to in the 8th century. And he has to tailor it toward a future that they're willing to buy into. And one of the reasons why his words have endured is that he succeeded. Somehow he was able to take the right amount of the former things and leave some others behind and bring in the newer things in order to present a book that is at one time familiar enough that the people could call it their own, and yet revolutionary in that it's calling them in new directions and presenting a God who's decidedly bigger, more international, more cosmic than what the God had been when all they knew was living in Judah. The experience of exile has expanded their view of the world, and their view of God has likewise expanded. Second Isaiah does not simply repeat the former things. He does not roll up the scroll and swear on an unchanged version of his past. He marshals the former things to speak to his present world. He cites the tradition of old, but then reshapes them, so to speak, so that he has a future for his people. What we've seen in all of these texts, the ancient Near Eastern texts, the biblical texts, is that the biblical world's understanding of the literary enterprise seems to be more fluid than ours. Isaiah struggled with the received tradition of his ancestors. He struggled to decide which aspects of a sacred past could be useful for a renewed future. He sifted through the former things. He produced a mixtape of sorts in order to offer a new song that was familiar and yet wholly different. There are clearly some ways that the biblical writers and the writers of the ancient Near East are very much like us. I'm always relieved to read a text from 2,000 years ago and think, my, how recognizable this person is. They, like us, recognize the power of the written word. They know how to use attribution to confer authority. In some cases, they can cite a source in ways that are very familiar to our own academic standards. They also seem to recognize and despise the false pen and the one who would claim credit for the work of another. But most of our biblical texts and the Bible as a whole is far more like this example from Isaiah. We have multiple unmarked and unnamed authors, and each of them is sifting through the former things of old. They're receiving authoritative traditions of their ancestors and reworking them for new contexts and challenges. So I want to close with a challenge of my own and encourage you not to limit the Bible to its closed book, authoritative, unchanging status. Open it. Read it in all of its multi-layered complexity. Get to know its authors, named and unnamed. By all means, remember the former things, but don't be afraid to see and announce something new. Thank you.